Hey friends, I'm so glad you're back to join me for another See the Light, Yes You Can Draw Club. I'm Pat Nepley, I'm your master artist, and let's review what you're going to need for today's meeting. Just a few basic things that you should have because this is a very special lesson. So come on over and look. You're going to need a few sheets of white paper. I'm going to be using a toned paper, it's easier to see. Regular size is fine. A standard pencil, a good eraser, and a ruler or some other straight edge. Because I'm going to be working on my large easel, I'm going to be using a large yardstick, but you can use just a standard 12-inch ruler, that would be fine. Because today we're going to be talking about perspective. And perspective is when you're trying to take something on a flat piece of paper and by using the rules of perspective drawing, make it appear 3D, have depth. You remember, we talked about it when we talked about space, about the importance of showing not only length and width, but depth. That's what makes drawings look real. In fact, let me show you a really fabulous artist. He's a French artist named Gustave Caillebotte, and he is the master of something called one-point perspective. Here's a painting of his called The Gardeners. You'll notice there's two workers in vegetables in neat rows. Can you see how the closer vegetables appear much larger than those further back? And that the gardener that's pouring water appears larger than his friend? And that's because Caillebotte used the principles of perspective drawing. Remember horizon line when we were talking about space? The horizon line where the sky meets the land, and how it's so important to use the horizon line well. Well, you're going to be hearing a lot about that term as we're talking about perspective. Now this club meeting and our next club meeting, we're talking about something called linear perspective, and that just means it has to do with lines. Perhaps in your math class you learned about lines. Lines that can be vertical or horizontal, and we're going to be talking about special lines that relate to our main horizon line. So for the first thing we're going to do, grab a piece of paper and write across your page with your ruler. You're going to take a standard pencil and very lightly draw a line. Now mine's going to be a little darker so that you can see it, but your line's going to be lighter. Just right across like that. Now when we're working with perspective, friends, it's important to always use your ruler. And you'll see why in a little bit, because in order to be accurate, your lines have to be perfectly straight. Now, this is our horizon line. It's our imaginary line where the sky meets the land. And on this horizon line, there's one very special point. And I want you to mark that point now. I'm going to put it right in the center, right there. That point, my friends, is called our vanishing point. That's the point on the horizon when, as an object starts to recede or move away from you, as it keeps on going, it eventually looks like it vanishes. Vanish means to disappear. But it doesn't really disappear. It just looks like it disappears. Have you ever been to the ocean? And as you're sitting on the beach, maybe there's some sailboats, and you watch the boat for a while, and it keeps on going out and keeps on going out, and eventually, as it's right at the horizon line, where the ocean meets the sky, it looks like it disappears. That is the vanishing point. So our vanishing point is on the horizon line, always on the horizon line. But you know, it makes me think of something. I'm so glad God doesn't have a vanishing point. He never disappears. Do you know that? In fact, it says it in Scripture, so let's take a look. In the Bible, in the book of Deuteronomy, there's a great passage. Deuteronomy 31:8. It says, "The Lord himself goes before you, and he will be with you. He will never leave you or forsake you. Do not be afraid, and do not be discouraged." So God never vanishes, even when it sometimes feels like he's far away or that we're far away from him. He's always there. He will never leave us. What an amazing promise that is. No matter what you're going through, God is there with you. Wow. Now back to our perspective drawing. You saw in Caillebotte's painting of the gardeners how all of those lines, the vegetables, the lines of the wall, went back to the vanishing point. So we're going to be working with 1 point perspective, and this vanishing point is our 1 point. So let's just do a study, and we'll pretend that we're at a railroad track, and all of our lines are going to lead to the vanishing point. So take your ruler. I'm going to use my larger yardstick, and I'm going to make a kind of what looks like a giant triangle. All I'm doing is making a big line from the bottom of my page at an angle like this to the vanishing point. And then I'm going to do another one from the other side, like that. So it looks like a giant triangle. Again, all lines lead to the vanishing point. Well, if I were to pretend that this is a railroad track, I need to understand that there's certain principles that apply in perspective. And the first rule of perspective is that objects that are closer appear larger, and objects that are further away appear much smaller. So, if the front of the railroad track, I want to make a railroad tie, lay your ruler right across the bottom of the page so that the bottom edge is at the bottom, and using the top edge of your ruler, simply draw a line from one side to the other. If we were to say that that's our first railroad tie, according to the principle of perspective, that objects that are closer are larger and those that recede or are further away appear smaller, then we're going to make the railroad ties as they go back smaller. Now that, of course, if I'm connecting from side to side, they will be smaller from left to right, but what it means is the actual tie would be thinner. So let's say I make my railroad tie using my straight edge about that thick. They're not going to stay that thick going back. Our rule of perspective says that even though they're the exact same size, they appear to get smaller as they recede. So that means my railroad ties will have to get thinner as they go back. But I'm not going to draw them yet, because there's a second rule of perspective you need to remember. And that's objects that are equidistant apart, that means the same distance apart, as they move away further back, appear to be closer together. So, in addition to making my railroad ties thinner as I go back, I also need to make them closer together. So, let's just say our first railroad tie is here. The next one is several feet apart, so take your ruler and draw a line across. Now I'm going to make it thinner than this one. I'm going to switch to my small ruler just so you can see my lines through it. This is about a 1-inch railroad tie. I need to make this one thinner. You can make yourself some guidelines. And now, keeping my lines nice and straight, always using a ruler. So now it's not only thinner, you can see how this railroad tie is thicker than this one. Let's see how far apart. 1.5 inches. I know that the objects have to appear to get closer together as I go back. So I won't make it 1.5 inches heading back. I'll make it a little closer. And this is what you're going to do, my friends. You're just going to keep going, making your railroad ties not only thinner as you go back. Miss Pat's got to get in front, make sure I get my lines straight, but also closer together. Now, you don't have to do a lot of measuring, my friends. What you can do is you can do this by sight. So I'm going to start just making my lines closer together and thinner to create the illusion that the railroad ties are heading back. So you can see that this is thicker, wide apart, a little bit thinner, a little closer, a little thinner, a little closer, and you keep on going. That's the two principles of linear perspective. Objects that are closer appear larger than objects that are further away, and objects that are larger are closer together as they recede back. Okay? Now what about our 1 point? this kind of creates the illusion of railroad ties going back. But what if we were to put a train station by our railroad tracks? Again, we have an object that's going to be closer, so on the left side of your paper, make a nice long vertical line, and it's going to cross over your horizon line. Now, my lines are dark. Your lines should be light, because if this is a building, you won't see this horizon line behind it. Let's say this is the front edge of our little train station. It's like a ticket window. So it's a booth on the side. So this is the front. This is the front edge. But what about if I'm trying to show that it's along the railroad tracks? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take any line that recedes along with the railroad track, it's parallel to it, is going to go towards the vanishing point. Do you know what parallel means? That's when there's two lines that actually are the same width apart all the way. But it appears as though the lines come together. And that's a trick of the eye because of perspective. So you know that this railroad track, they're actually parallel lines. Otherwise, the train couldn't run. The rails are the exact same length. But it appears that the lines come together. So if the front of our ticket booth is parallel to the railroad tracks, we're going to connect the front of the ticket booth again to the vanishing point. So I'm just going to draw my line. I'm not going to draw it all the way back because my train station is not quite that big. But by having my line all the way to the vanishing point, I'm following the rules of perspective. Now I can make another vertical line, but I'm not quite sure how high I should make it. Well, if I'm doing the top of our ticket booth, which is parallel to the railroad tracks, I need to make sure it heads to the one vanishing point. So let's say I decide that right up here, this is the top of my ticket booth. This is as tall as I want to make it. You can make it any height you want. I'm going to make mine right there. This top corner, that's the line I'm going to go off of. And so I'm going to connect to the vanishing point. Make sure you're accurate and draw my line. So now I have a building on the side of the railroad tracks that is in correct perspective, all lines leading to the vanishing point. In fact, anything that you would put in this drawing that you know is on a parallel plane with the road or the railroad track would lead to the vanishing point. Now, not everything in the world is that straight on. It's kind of tricky. But this kind of exercise in one-point perspective is important for you to grasp so that when you do freehand draw without a ruler, you can still make it look real. In fact, here's an amazing painting, also by Gustave Caillebotte, called The House Painters. It's incredible when you look at those perfect lines. You can see why he was a master of one-point perspective. He used a ruler to get all of those lines perfect. It's fun to watch how the edges of the building all go to one vanishing point. But Caillebotte also used some other things in the painting to make us understand how far down the street we're looking. Notice how the house painters, the one on the ladder and his friend, are about the same size in the foreground. But the people on the sidewalk in the background are much smaller. So you realize how deep of a scene we're looking at as the house painters paint in the streets of Paris. So you want to keep on making your lines, keep on making railroad ties that get thinner and closer together as you go back. Supposing you wanted to put something on the other side. Well, in order to really explore this principle, make sure you really understand one-point perspective, let's just do a couple more things on this right-hand side so you fully get it. The first thing we're going to put right here in the foreground is a telephone pole. Maybe you don't see many telephone poles anymore, but just use your ruler as a guide, cross over the horizon line, and make a vertical line. You can even make it the width of your ruler. Now you see how I cross the horizon line because the telephone pole is tall, and even though it's in the foreground, it would go up into what appears to be the sky and cross over our horizon line. I want to make a cross piece to my telephone pole, which means I want almost like a T. And I'll make that smaller. So I make a little cross piece at the top. There we go. Now you remember our rules of one-point perspective are that objects that are larger appear to get smaller as they recede towards the vanishing point. So even if I were to have 10 of these telephone poles all in a row along our railroad track, they would appear to get smaller. So how do I know what size they should be? Again, we always go to the vanishing point. So if this is my bottom of my telephone pole, I'll draw a very light line to the vanishing point. And if this is the top of my cross piece, I will draw another line right to my vanishing point. And that triangle that's drawn there tells me the height of all of the other telephone poles that will be on the row, because all of the poles will have to have the same height. So this is the cross piece. So I can make a mark at where the next cross piece will end. And I can see the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And this is where that cross piece will end. Now when you have something where there's a horizontal line, it gets a little tricky. So I'll just put in all of my horizontal lines using those dots that I made first. And I'm getting a little smaller each time. Can you start to see it, my friends? One-point perspective. If I'm looking down the railroad track, everything on this side and everything on this side, if they're parallel to the railroad track, leads to the vanishing point. Just look at those paintings by our friend Gustav Caillebotte. Perfect precision down to the vanishing point. And doing exercises like this to understand one-point perspective is great practice so that you can be an artist like Caillebotte. And I know you can do it. So to really understand, let me show you what we have here. I've already drawn 3 cubes. And you'll see, here's my horizon line. This cube is above the horizon line. That means it's above eye level or in the sky. This cube is right at eye level, much like our train station. It's on the ground, we're right in front of it. This cube is well below the horizon line or eye level, so you can see the top and see the side of the cube. But you'll notice all the sides of these cubes lead to our single vanishing point. So depending on where you've placed it related to the horizon line determines how much of the cube you see. So you see, you will use perspective to take something that's flat, like a shape, and make it into a form, like a cube. This one happens to just be above the horizon line, at the horizon line, and below, all to one vanishing point. So when we go back to our study that we're doing, these are crossing over our horizon line, but if I were to make an object up here, maybe a tall chimney or some other piece of the building, those lines would all be way above the horizon line, but still the edges would lead to the vanishing point. Now you're going to need to take some time and really practice working on one-point perspective. If something like a railroad track or a street feels too difficult, just try it with a square that you turn into a cube. Place the square to the left of the vanishing point and then to the right of the vanishing point, and practice above the horizon line or below the horizon line. The key is all lines leading to your one vanishing point. Next time that we're together, friends, we're still going to be working on perspective, but since the whole world does not lead down one single road to one point, we're going to be working on two-point perspective. So I hope you'll join me again. Hope to see you next time.